They've now seen as the sort of greatest military power of the Middle East, the technological leader of the, whose technology is the greatest, completely collapse in front of a small group of Hamas. This is the most difficult. Gaza, I know it well, is a shambolic urban setting. And how do you go? You go in there. If Hezbollah joins this conflict, opens a front, this would present an existential threat to the future of Israel.
You are watching and listening to the New Rules podcast. I'm your host, Dimitri Simes Jr., and our guest today is Alastair Crooke. Hello, this is the New Rules podcast, and I am your host, Dimitri Simes Jr. Last Saturday, Hamas shocked the world by launching a surprise attack into southern Israel, accompanied by missile attacks on Tel Aviv. We're recording this episode on Tuesday, October 10th, and the dust has still not settled. Many basic questions remain unanswered. Why did this crisis erupt? How was Hamas able to catch Israel supposedly completely off guard? And are we on the brink of a new major war in the Middle East? To help us discuss these issues, we're very happy to welcome Alastair Crooke, a former British diplomat and MI6 agent. Alastair, thank you so much for joining the program.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
This is obviously a fast-evolving situation, but I want to step back and try to understand the big picture. What exactly triggered this latest Israeli-Palestinian crisis, and what was Hamas's motivation behind trying to launch its surprise attack?
Okay, well, I have to go back a little bit and put it into the context. And it's a context that I think is not really very well understood outside of the region. And that context is that the Israeli politics have been completely divided. They are, if you like, they're in two parts. They're almost equally weighty movements that are opposed to one another in Israeli politics at the moment and are struggling. But the point is they don't share a vision about the future. They don't have a vision about history. And more importantly, they disagree fundamentally on what it is to be Jewish. More particularly, one side is Mizrahi, and the other side is largely Ashkenazi, liberal, secular forms. And it was quite astonishing. I was really struck when seeing suddenly the Mizrahi. For your audience, I should say the Mizrahi are the Oriental Jews who come from the Arab world and from North Africa. And the Ashkenazi are mostly the Europeans. And it was extraordinary because the Mizrahi have always been the underclass, the elements that have been put down in Israeli society, and they turned the tables and were now in office and in power and intent on taking forward their projects. And they are part of Netanyahu's government. They sit in cabinet and they have ministers. And they have two basic key commitments that affect us and affect what's happening at the moment. One is they intend to build the third temple on Temple Mount. Now, in doing this, they have a broad commitment to do this from the government as a whole. But let me just be clear, to be absolutely clear. In order to build the third temple on the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, that means demolishing Al-Aqsa, the third holiest site in Islam, and a very important icon to all Muslims, Sunni and Shia. It means demolishing it in order for the temple to be rebuilt. But this is what the government is committed to doing in due course. The second commitment is to create Israel on the land of Israel. It's not that at the moment. But that would mean, again, to be very clear, that would basically mean removing the Palestinians from the West Bank, from most of the West Bank, either by, if you like, legal persuasion or by the settlers actually just taking action themselves and removing them. And what this says really, I mean, for the Palestinians, is that if Al-Aqsa becomes Judaicized, and if Israel is established as the state on the land of Israel and adopts Jewish law, halakha, then what is there of Palestine? What is there for the Palestinian state or Palestinian people to exist? So it's really an existential issue for Palestinians. And so we've seen during this process a period where every so often there is a provocation. And some of your listeners may recall that some 2 years ago, similarly, there was the settlers invaded the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa Mosque and took it over. And the reaction was very harsh from Hamas, who fired many missiles into Tel Aviv and into the surrounding areas. And there was the beginning of something that was unparalleled. Because it was Al-Aqsa, also what we call the Palestinians of Israel, the Palestinians who are in Israel and Israeli citizens, as well as the West Bank, all of them rose up together. And it was for the first time we've seen a concerted, if you like, action. And it was not for Palestine. It was not for Hamas. It was about saving Al-Aqsa. And this is, if you like, it's an icon that resonates across the Middle East and is resonating now with demonstrations and meetings and huge mass mobilizations in support of Al-Aqsa. And then what happened was what triggered it, because this has been a process that has been going on and it was expected there will be more provocations. And then last Thursday, don't forget the action took place on Saturday. On Thursday, a large number of settlers invaded Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa Mosque. With the connivance and with the support of the security forces, they went on and took it. And that, I think, was probably the sort of, if not the motive, because, it's been a recurring series of provocations, but this was the pretext to launch what Hamas had been preparing and which had planned. And then we had the invasion of Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that, I think, was the signal to say, okay, it's game on.
So, I mean, this is really interesting. So even though the operation itself was launched from the territory of Gaza, the area in question, the area that is the source of detention, is the West Bank.
The area that is the source of detention is Old Jerusalem and the site of the Temple Mount, which is both revered both by the Jews as the site of their first two temples, and is also the site, if you like, the most holy mosque for the Muslim world. And the Temple Mount is off limits for non-Muslims to enter the actual, if you like, Al-Aqsa, the mosque itself, and to pray there. Only Muslims can do that. But at the moment, the security forces are allowing radical settlers. And Ben-Gvir, who's the Minister for Security, has been very adamant in saying, this is ours. The Temple Mount is ours. And a few weeks ago, the entire cabinet of Netanyahu, the complete cabinet, went and held their cabinet meeting in the tunnels immediately below Al-Aqsa Mosque, in the tunnels underneath the mosque itself, and said, this is ours. It's our property. We control it. And so this was seen as a huge threat to Muslims everywhere. But particularly a cause around which Hamas is rallying people in the West Bank and in, if you like, the Israeli Palestinians, as well as the rest of the world. And as I say, there are enormous protests taking place, not only just because of that, but because of the bombing that's taking place in Gaza at the moment.
And earlier this year, former Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Yaalon said that the radicals within the Israeli government wanted a big war in the Middle East. Since we've been talking about the two different factions in Israeli society, Who are exactly these radicals, and why do they want a big war?
Well, the radicals are a coalition, and they involve, first of all, if you like, the radical settler and the national religious groups together in a broad coalition. And as I say, they are committed, the settler groups are committed to taking and building and, if you like, populating the West Bank with another 1 million settlers, which would leave little room for the Palestinians. And already there's been clearance. The settlers, with threats and violence, have removed Palestinians from a large swathe of area from Ramallah through to Jericho and expelled them from their land. So what all this amounts to is really, from the perspective of the Palestinians, what Ben-Gvir and what is called the Temple Mount movement are planning is something that resembles the Nakba Day. That was a great day of shame for Palestinians when they were cleansed from their homes and their villages and put into trains and sent off to Syria and other places to go into refugee camps. For them, it was a very powerful, very emotive prospect. Now, in order to do it, they need to do two things. And they said this even 10 years ago, the right people. And it goes back even further. The right said, I remember that the man who's now the justice minister was saying, look, we were going to do this step by step. But the first thing is we have to get rid of the Supreme Court, which would otherwise impede us. And then we have to move in order to reestablish Israel on the land of Israel, and to turn it into a full Jewish state. But to do that, they, rather like we've seen in other areas, they need the emergency, not COVID, but they need something like this, that they can change the laws and that they can move ahead. So he's right. They need an emergency of some sort in order to actually implement this plan and to turn it into reality. And what Hamas is doing is forestalling this operation. That's what it's like. It's about forestalling this happening. And then now we're now in a very different circumstances. Israel has been humiliated and feels very much the defeat of what's happened in the last few days, and is going to take revenge. And my main concern is that the reaction by the government, and they are angry, and everyone understands why they're angry. They are very angry, and they have promised to reduce Gaza to rubble and to finish Hamas for good in Gaza. Now, what they're threatening to do, which they haven't done before, they're bombing Gaza, and many people are dying in the bombing. But they threatened to put troops in, to put the Israeli Defense Force in, and there are some 80 to 100,000 troops being prepared. Now, first of all, I think this is going to be a disaster. But the second thing is this escalation crosses the red line of Hezbollah in the north. And they said if there is an invasion of Gaza by Israel, then they will, if you like, trigger the next front. They will open the next front, i.e. the Lebanese Hezbollah front, into this conflict. And as things stand, because already the northern area is heating up, there've been exchanges. The Israelis have, with artillery fire, have killed 3 Hezbollah cadre members, members of their army, of their forces, and wounded 4. And Hezbollah said they are now just waiting for the moment to kill 3 Israeli military officers in revenge for this. So I think we're on a course for escalation. And what is particularly worrying is, the language being used in Israel, even by serious commentators like Giora Aland, who is a former security advisor, and he's saying we have to move. What is the next thing? We have to move to a humanitarian disaster in Gaza, so great that it changes the, if you like, the paradigm. And that is what is being planned. And the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, says he's spoken to Biden and told him it has to happen. We are going to invade. But I can tell you, I mean, the Hamas operation has been well planned, clearly well planned, very well executed in its concept. And of course, they knew and they expected that the reaction, the Pavlovian reaction, is always that Israel then bombs Gaza. It happened 2 years ago, and it's happened several times earlier. So they knew that. And so what do we expect? Well, if the troops do go into Gaza, and I was during the first Intifada, I was in Nablus and in Jenin, and I saw this. This is the most difficult. Gaza, I know it well, is a shambolic urban setting. And if you want to fight guerrilla war in it, couldn't be worse, because you move meter by meter. You can't go into a street because there will be snipers. You have to watch out going into any house that there isn't a booby trap. You have to move by breaking through the walls of one house to the next, to the next. That's the sort of fighting. They could be there a very long time, I think.
I think that the recent battles for Bakhmut and Mariupol are testaments to that. Urban warfare is extraordinarily difficult. And we can't forget that Hamas are some of the most experienced troops, in the Middle East, maybe even on the planet. Whereas what we've seen from the Israelis so far isn't all that impressive. I'm not sure how they're going to be taking, block by block, quarter by quarter.
Well, you're right. It's just like Bakhmut, Artyomovsk. This is very clear. No, it will be very costly for them. And I know that that Gaza is riddled with tunnels and bunkers that were. Originally, the Hamas had some difficulty in constructing them, but they got help from others in other parts of the Middle East, and now they're constructed. And so, and how do you go? You go in there. What are you looking for? How do you identify a Hamas member? He doesn't have a tattoo on, or he doesn't have a uniform. They're not distinguishable from any other male population, and the population is large, about 3 million altogether in Gaza.
I'm guessing that, what the Israelis might be banking on is that they have such overwhelming Air Force superiority that they can just level all the buildings in Gaza to the ground and hopefully move in troops there. But I'm not sure to what extent that's a viable strategy as well, because even when you fight in the rubble, urban warfare is very difficult.
Well, this is what they're doing. And there are apartment blocks that are being razed to the ground, which have all the families in them. The huge casualties coming out of this. They are just bombing. It's supposedly against targets, but they bombed the third oldest Christian church in the world there. So it wasn't such a very obvious military target. But they're also bombing and collapsing, just as they did in Beirut in 2006 in the Dahi area. They're just collapsing these buildings, often on the people and the population. And of course, this is the visuals of this. The television is broadcast around the Arab world, and it's stirring huge protests and anger and movements. And so, how long are they going to do this for? How long are they going to continue? And what happens if they insert troops and then Hezbollah enters the war? I just saw before coming on this program that Hamas have told the residents of Ashkelon, which is an Israeli city, to evacuate it. Now, I don't know what they're intending, but the Hamas forces have not been all eliminated. They're still present, some parts of the territory. But clearly, I mean, I think everything points to, I mean, at the moment, unless someone can pull it back, we're on an escalatory pathway. Now, what I saw just before I came on again also, which is really quite concerning, is that apparently, this is in Yediot Ahronot, the Israeli paper, and they are saying that that a French diplomat has passed a message to Hezbollah saying that if Hezbollah were to open the front in Lebanon, then Israel, and it claims with American support, will attack Damascus and take out Assad and all of the leadership of Syria. And it suggests that the aircraft carrier group that has been sent there would be in a position to take out the leadership of Syria. And they said to this letter purports, I mean, this is in the Yediot Ahronot, which is a serious newspaper, saying that this is the threat that Israel is making to deter Hezbollah from interfering with turning Gaza into rubble.
I want to remind our audience members that you are watching and listening to the New Rules podcast. I'm your host, Dimitri Simes Jr., and our guest today is Alastair Crooke. Alastair, we left off talking about the prospect of U.S. interference involvement in this conflict, but I want to step back for a moment and ask you, what does this crisis mean for the U.S. standing in the Middle East? Because obviously, over the past several years, both the Trump and Biden administrations have tried to reconcile Israel with the Arab world in order to form a grand anti-Iranian coalition. Is that initiative basically dead?
Yes, it is. I still see it. They talk about, this great reconciliation with Saudi Arabia and Israel as a game changer that'll change everything. It won't. It won't change it because, I don't know if they don't follow the news or something, but haven't they heard China mediated a reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia? It was several months in the preparation and has been very successful. And most of the Gulf states are now cooperating and indeed involving themselves in things like a Gulf Naval Force, protection force. And the whole Saudi Arabia is a candidate member for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and has just joined the BRICS, of which Iran is a member of both those organizations. And they only became that because of the support of Iran for that. So the idea that the Gulf is, that has already been moving towards the heartland and towards the, if you like, the new model of Asia, the development of Asia, and are very excited about the economic prospects, will suddenly come to form an anti-Iranian alliance, I think is quite improbable. It's against Saudi interests for a start, because actually Saudi needs high oil prices and is much more in line with Russia on that. And of course, Biden wants to keep the oil price at the rock bottom. And that's not in the Saudi interest because he's got all this new investment in the big cities and industries he has to pay for. And that requires oil price around $100 or more to finance that.
You mentioned that as we speak, the USS Gerald Ford aircraft carrier is moving into the Eastern Mediterranean with the goal of A, showing support for Israel, and B, sending a menacing message to both Iran and Hezbollah. How close is the United States to becoming embroiled in another war in the Middle East?
At this point, quite close. If it isn't careful, but I think, that what we see, as I say, is that this is going to be led by the Israelis overreacting. I mean, everyone understands that, the pain and anguish that they feel. But if they overreact, they will open other fronts. And in opening other fronts, they could put themselves at existential risk. And I don't know how clear that is in the White House and to the team, but that is the risk that we're in. I mean, this language of calling Hamas animals and fine, this is the stuff that you see on television and everything like this. But, the defense minister, the president, and the prime minister shouldn't be using languages which says that Hamas are not humans. They're somehow inhuman, and therefore what happens to them doesn't matter. If they exaggerate the reaction, there's a real danger that the US can find itself pulled into a conflict. It may not want it. In fact, I'm sure Biden does not want it in the run-up to the 24 election. But I think at the same time, there is a risk of this, especially now that we see this steady escalation going on the northern front with Hezbollah. And that will determine, I think, greatly whether this will happen. But if they go ahead and put 100,000 troops into Gaza, then anything is possible.
And I guess what sort of calculus do you think would drive Hezbollah's decision to intervene or not? Because I think that's the million-dollar question right now for everyone. Because so far, Hezbollah has issued warnings, but they haven't, beyond the sort of reports of artillery fire, there hasn't been any sort of direct military intervention. What do you think will drive Hezbollah's decision to ultimately join the conflict or not?
Well, there has been some direct military intervention. Hezbollah, a few days ago, 2 or 3 days ago, destroyed 3 Israeli radar base posts. These were in the Sheba Farms area, which is recognized as Lebanese territory, but is occupied by Israel. There was an Israeli response, and now we've moved to a response by Hezbollah that ended up with firing on bases, military bases inside Israel, and with the reaction of Israel to killing 3 of the Hezbollah cadres. And Hezbollah says they will react to that, and they will respond by killing 3 Israelis. I mean, it's very reminiscent for me of what started the 2006 war. I mean, if you recall, it was Hezbollah taking 2 soldiers, taking them hostage across the border. They slipped across the border and took 2 Israelis hostage in reaction for what Israel was doing in Lebanon at that point. So it's quite sort of similar. And Hezbollah has said it very clearly. I mean, Hassan Nasrallah has said, if Israel goes into Gaza militarily, then we will open a front, the next front. I mean, most people, including I, interpret that as quite a clear red line.
I want to play devil's advocate for a moment because before the show, we had an opportunity to interview some former Israeli military and intelligence officers, and they basically made the following argument. Yes, we were caught off guard by Hamas over the past weekend, and we didn't show ourselves in the best light. But still, at the end of the day, we are the best military in the Middle East, and we are more than capable of taking on both Hamas and Hezbollah. We have the best technology, the best hardware, the best everything. Are they wrong?
Yes, that's the public line. That's the propaganda. I mean, I've seen them up close, and I've seen them in 2006. In 2006, they lost the war. And Hezbollah had a technological advantage over them. They were intercepting the Israeli military communications. They were intercepting the messages, the ciphered messages coming from Tel Aviv to Beirut. They had their security, the Hezbollah's operational practices. I mean, it was a defeat. And the army was not very impressive. There were times when they didn't even manage to provide, the reserves would arrive and there was no food and there was no transport for them. And it was a bit like this last weekend. I mean, it was pretty chaotic. And look what we saw. I mean, again, a former senior military officer in Israel said, look, at this time, the command and control structure of the army just collapsed when Hamas broke through the Erez crossing. It just collapsed, and there were no troops, and there was no ability to respond at all. They just saw an implosion. So it's not really that great. And technology cuts two ways. I just like to sort of say, the shift over to AI as a means of intelligence gathering has not been very successful, neither in Ukraine for the Americans and for NATO and their computer modeling efforts, but nor has it for the Israelis, because there comes a point when you have so much information and data bits and everything like this that you don't have a clear picture. You just have a jumble of information. And AI is supposed to sort it out. But, to understand how people are thinking, how sentiment is running, you need emotional intelligence and not just the intelligence of AI. You have to have some sort of empathy or some understanding. I mean, I saw this in the past there. I mean, the West is finding it harder and harder to understand, to empathize with other, if you like, civilizations, whether it's Russian or Iranian. They reduce it to a sort of instrumentalism that they can do it and think if they collect enough data points, they will understand how Russia thinks and how Iran thinks. And of course, they don't get into that to get into the mindset. They don't get into the way of thinking, which is quite different. Even the language is quite different. And the capabilities of AI to understand symbolic meaning, and let alone some of the sort of esoteric elements of Islamic meaning. I mean, it's just, it depends on who's writing the AI. But I mean, for sure, it'll be someone who's lived all their life in the Western sphere and finds this all a mystery.
So this sort of seems like the Israelis have a classic problem seen across Western militaries, where you have these sort of very expensive high-tech toys that you fill up your weapons arsenal with. But when it comes to real battlefield conditions, they just don't stand up.
Yes, you have it exactly right. Remember, it was Jake Sullivan 2 weeks ago said the Middle East has never been quieter. It's been so quiet during this time. I actually don't have to spend much time following it because it's so quiet. And that's, this is the delusions. I mean, we've experienced that very much in the case of, the Western thinking about Russia and getting it wrong so many times on its attempt to try and understand Russian intentions and Russian plans. And, they apply just, their sort of mechanical way of rationality to it. And it just doesn't always work very well.
So, I mean, I guess that begs the question. So if Hezbollah does intervene and the Israeli military finds itself fighting on two fronts, what do you expect to happen?
Well, I expect to be surprised. I know that sounds a sort of contrarian view, but I think this is not unexpected, what's happening. It's been planned, and I would think that Hezbollah have surprises up their sleeve, and I can't even guess at what they are. they might actually invade Israel. It's quite possible they would do that. They have 100,000 troops, all experienced. They've been fighting in Syria against ISIS, Daesh for a long time. They're experienced. They're very sophisticated technically. I don't know what they'd do. I mean, look, even little Hamas sort of flew in its its people on hang gliders across the fence.
And, if, Israel ends up finding itself on the ropes where it's facing a tough fight from Hezbollah from the north, from Hamas to the south, what sort of position does that leave the United States in?
The United States does not want war with Iran because it knows that if it starts a war with Iran, it could imperil the existence of Israel. I mean, that's putting it very straightforwardly. So it's not looking for war. And you've heard Iran, the US officials say very clearly, they don't believe Iran was involved in the planning of what happened in Gaza and afterwards. I don't think they want that. I think the only thing they can do is to try and get some form of mediation to start. But that would mean that Israel would have to give. This is a problem that just hasn't been resolved for decades. I mean, and gets worse and worse and worse. The attempt from Oslo to find a solution was, I think, flawed from the outset. But I think, and I was quite involved in it, but I think that it's very difficult to see now how they could find the solution that would allow two people to exist together in some sort of sustained relationship over the longer term. It would mean big changes in Israel. And I think culturally that will not be easy for Israelis to cope with it. Culturally and psychologically, I don't think, are prepared for making concessions. I very much hope they are. I mean, just like, in the case of Russia, I mean, the great lacuna is at the end of the Second World War, there was never a written treaty that established spheres of interest. I mean, basic things like that. It was not done. It was left to sort of vague understandings and a few comments here or there about not an inch further than Germany. And this is still the same problem there, that there hasn't become a sort of basis by which there can be a discussion about the interests of the Western sphere and what is increasingly becoming, the heartland sphere. They have interests. I mean, Russia and China have interests because of trade and transport corridors and the Belt and Road and the North-South corridor, all these things too. But there isn't anyone who seems able or willing to do that or to start and say, let us define how, the Atlantic sphere is going to live with the heartland sphere for the next 10 years and deal with any crisis that should come up. But, sometimes it's going to be necessary.
I want to remind our audience members that you are watching and listening to the New Rules podcast. I'm your host, Dimitri Simes Jr., and our guest today is Alastair Crooke. Alastair, I think it's fair to say that the timing of this crisis could not be worse for the Biden administration because we're 4 months into a Ukrainian counteroffensive that I think has disappointed everyone in the West. We're at a juncture point where people in Congress are locking horns over the future of Ukraine funding. And now you have this explosion in a part of the world that many Americans consider to be more strategically important than Ukraine. So my question is this: how does the Israeli-Hamas crisis impact NATO's proxy war in Ukraine?
Oh, I mean, in some sense, you put it very mildly, but I think the offensive is so clearly failed failed in all sorts of senses. But now Ukraine is in a position where it doesn't have men, it doesn't have ammunition, it doesn't have money, and above all, it doesn't have the sort of will to go on with the war. I mean, its manpower has been decimated during this offensive. It has achieved nothing. So in some ways, you could say that this could be a way out for America, that while the attention is turned to what's happening in Israel, this would be an ideal moment for them to just quietly, move away, back off Ukraine and concentrate on Israel and China. Whether they will do that, because at the same time, what's happened in Israel seems to have stirred up a great sort of head of steam under the neocons and the war hawks. I mean, generally, not just about Israel, but they're now looking at Iran and against all the security threats that America is facing, including Ukraine. So, I mean, it depends about how much power and how much sort of zest there is given to the sort of Lindsey Grahams and the others to sort of say, no, well, we mustn't leave Ukraine out. But I mean, in another way of looking at it, it would be the ideal moment for the United States to cut its losses in Ukraine, get out, and let Moscow sort out the next stages of it and find some sort of new government. It needs a new government. It's not possible to do it with the existing Kiev government as far as Russia is concerned. They cannot deal with the ultra-nationalist group there because the ultra-nationalists don't accept Russians as really anything other than Asians and as such really not even human. And they say that, and that you can see that in the statements by people like Danilov, the National Security Secretary.
I was born and raised in the Washington, D.C. area, so I'm pretty familiar with the U.S. foreign policy establishment. And the one thing I can definitively say about them is that above all else, they think about prestige and status. And I remember how people were horrified by the fall of Kabul because it was this sort of vivid picture of, bearded men with AK-47 and sandals chasing out supposedly the most powerful military in the world. And that's why I'm inclined to think that both on Israel and Palestine and on Russia, Ukraine, even though the risks of escalation are very great, they will double down because they can't bear the idea of being humiliated by Russia and especially by Hamas.
Of course, there's going to be a read across. Just as the rest of the world has seen NATO humiliated and its doctrines exposed as hollow, and even its vaunted technological weapons not performing very well on the field and ending up as burnt-out hulks. I mean, what they've now seen is the sort of greatest military power of the Middle East, the technological leader of the, whose technology is the greatest, completely collapse in front of a small group of Hamas, coming out of their concentration camp and attacking the army, and the army was nowhere to be seen. And in fact, many of them were taken hostage. Many senior Israelis are now hostage. I mean, the hostage issue is going to be a problematical one. I think they've got a number of ones, including a major general and senior officers. Hamas have those as hostages now.
Don't you think that under those circumstances, given, the enormous reputational losses that are at play here, don't you think that the United States will potentially choose to escalate, even given all the risks involved?
Well, I think what you say is very possible and even probable, because I think that there is still, this delusion of exceptionality that exists in the West. And I'm talking not about just America, but in Europe as well. that somehow, we have the best army, we have the best equipment, we are technologically, these people are backwards compared with us. And they're finding out that is not true. But if they decide to double down in terms of a delusion, rather as it seems that Netanyahu may double down, thinking that by reducing Gaza to rubble is going to provide him with the victory that he's looking for to restore his reputation. And if White House thinks that after what's happened in Ukraine, that somehow, attacking Hezbollah or even Iran might be the way to restore the reputation of the United States, I think they would be making a great strategic mistake.
So, I think it's clear that the world is currently in a very tense situation. What do you expect to unfold over the next several weeks? Obviously, making predictions is a difficult and unforgiving business. But, what are some potential scenarios that you could see playing out?
Well, I think that what I would see playing out would be a quagmire in Gaza, into which the Israeli forces find themselves struggling to really make progress. There will be claims of great successes and progress, but are they real? Do they really have all that intelligence on Hamas? It seems perhaps they don't. And I think that is one aspect. And I think that we need to watch very carefully what happens with Hezbollah in the north. Hezbollah has a huge arsenal of missiles, something like 80,000 cruise missiles and smart drones. They would be a formidable ally. In fact, I think it was Gura Ireland said that if Hezbollah joins this conflict, opens a front, this would present an existential threat to the future of Israel.
And would he be right at saying that?
Yes.
I want to remind our audience members that you watched and listened to the New Rules podcast. I'm your host, Dimitri Simes Jr., and our guest today was Alastair Crooke. Alastair,